All right, hello YouTube. I'm Kyle. I've got a repertoire here for white that I'm going to talk about in this video. And in this video, we're going to talk about the Queen's Gambit declined and the Queen's Gambit accepted for white, and so how to play against those as white. And this is something that I've set up as a lead chess study. So this is going to be linked, and you can go ahead and follow along on lead chess. You can go and look at the study. The study is going to be a lot more detailed than I can be in a video. And so you're going to be able to go through it, at your own pace and really, figure out all the nuances there, right? This video, of course, I'm going to talk about the main ideas, but there's going to be a lot that I just can't cover because it's going to, it's just going to go on forever if I talk about everything. So just jumping into this, you know, what I wanted to do with this repertoire when I was setting this up was I wanted to look at an opening for white that would be very principled, but also very positional and very practical. So 3 Ps, right? um, and practical in the sense that it is an opening setup that I think a lot of your opponents over the board, but especially online and in Blitz, right? They're not going to be super familiar with this as black. If we're looking at move one, right, we're looking at the board here, D4 is just not played as much as E4, right? E4, Bobby Fischer's whole best by test, right? That's played a ton. In fact, I looked at the databases on Lichess a little bit, and E4 is way more popular, especially at lower levels. But even as you get higher rated, you're still seeing more E4 than D4, right? And so, black is just not going to be as prepared for D4 as E4, right? They're not going to be as practiced, I should say. So that's something that I think already is a huge advantage of D4. But then we're also going to be looking at a setup with D4 where we're playing knight F3 on move 2, which also cuts out some dangerous attempts that black has, right? So that's going to also make it a little bit rarer, a little bit more, off the beaten path a little bit, while still remaining very principled. And black isn't going to necessarily be able to use their favorite, like, super aggressive opening, right? So that's kind of the idea with this. Let's just jump into the moves here and look at some of them. So we've got D4 on move 1. Now, of course, your opponent could play any number of moves here, and this repertoire, we're going to look at pretty much all of the responses that make sense for black. But of course, most popular by far is going to be D5. So this is what you're going to get a lot of the time, mostly because black just wants to copy you, right? Black just wants to copy you, and then on top of copying you, right, this is just a very principled move, When we play D4, our whole idea, and I want to, kind of explain this so that, intermediate players can get a lot out of this, I think, but then especially players who are just starting to really think about their opening are going to get a lot out of this video. So I'm going to be explaining some kind of basics, some core ideas that are really important to remember. The idea with D4 is you're controlling the E5 square. You're making it hard for black to just play E5 on move 1. In fact, playing E5 on move 1 would just be a mistake. You would just take it. It would be a free pawn. And we'll talk about that actually in a later video. With D5, they're stopping you from playing E4. And that's something that you might play if they let you, right? If they don't stop E4, it's very reasonable to just go E4 yourself. So keep that in mind. If your opponent ever plays something really weird against you and they allow E4, I would recommend to play E4, at lower levels, at higher levels, of course. This is going to be a good move. So just keep that in mind. But now we play knight F3. And knight F3 does cut out some ideas. With the Queen's Gambit, just playing C4 right away, we're putting pressure on the center immediately. We're trying to take on D5, potentially, and kind of, cause all kinds of problems for black. But c4 allows the move e5. This is something called the Albin counter gambit. And there are some other options as well. For example, if they play knight f6 on move 1, then they can play e5, the Budapest gambit. And this is something we'll talk about later, is knight f6 on move 1. But the point is, if we play knight f3, we avoid these, right? So we don't allow e5. e5 is just not very good, right? And so this is actually going to be really nice for us as white, because we don't have to learn these openings. These aren't necessarily bad, or yeah, these aren't necessarily very good openings for black. They're not necessarily very bad openings for black. But the main thing about, these e5 openings for black is that they're going to be annoying for us. And if we're not very well prepared against them, it's going to cause problems, right? You don't really want to face these unprepared. So playing knight f3 makes it so we don't have to prepare against these, right? That's a really nice practical advantage, right? Going into, say, you're playing an over-the-board tournament. This is what I played a ton when I first started playing over the board, is this setup. I wouldn't have to worry about that. I wouldn't have to prepare that ahead of time. If you're playing online blitz, right? For example, it's even more important that you don't have to face something unprepared. And so this is cutting out some things that you're going to have to prepare against otherwise, right? Knight f6. This is, of course, pretty much standard for black. There are other moves, and we'll look at them, but knight f6 is pretty much what you're going to see most games. And you can play the most popular move here at lower levels anyway, bishop f4, the London, but I don't really recommend the London. The problem with the London, in my opinion, is it's not very good for the improving player. If you're trying to learn and improve, you shouldn't really play the London. You shouldn't play the other very popular move here, e3, the Kale system, either. Both of these lead to very, very static setups, so I wouldn't really recommend them. I would recommend c4. This is going to really get you to improve as a player, while still playing something that's going to be, not too hard to learn. So it's kind of, I would say, bridging the gap between, say, the very aggressive, very theory heavy openings out there and the system openings that are kind of boring, right? And don't really lead, they don't tend to lead to improving that much. C4 is putting pressure on black, and this is going to definitely score better, especially as you improve, than, say, the London would. Now, another thing to point out is, since the London is so popular and the Kale system is so popular, even, this is actually the surprise weapon now, right? At lower levels, online and blitz, this is something that black is not necessarily expecting to face. So that's going to help you a lot, actually, because you're playing a slightly more aggressive opening, an opening that definitely puts more pressure on your opponent. And then at the same time, they're not prepared for it as much. They don't have as much experience against it like they would with the London. So this is something that I think is really good in that sense. E6. We're going to look at, of course, other moves, but this is the most popular move. If I look at the database, even at lower levels, this is by far the most popular move, E6. And this is the Queen's Gambit declined. This is what I would recommend for most players as black, especially if they don't want to learn too much here. But now we just play knight c3. And this is a setup, actually, that is kind of like a tabia position. There's going to be a lot of potential things that black could do here. Very popular, kind of surprised me, very popular, something called the Rogozin. We'll talk about that in a later video. But what we're going to look at here, which is also very popular, is bishop e7. Just the standard idea. And the point of bishop e7 is that if you play bishop to g5, right, this is kind of our setup as white. We're trying to get our bishop out. We get both our knights out, we get our bishop out, and then we play e3, right? And then our other bishop can get out. And we've kind of got this harmonious setup for everything, right? The thing with bishop to g5 here is it's the most popular move. It's a good move. But we aren't really pinning this knight, right? They've already set up against that with bishop e7. So the knight can move, and then we might just trade bishops. In fact, bishop g5, knight e4. Oops, sorry, bishop g5, knight e4, right? That's an idea. Just jumping out of the way and saying, all right, let's start trading pieces. So that's something you can play as white and do just fine, I will say. But what I've got recommended here is the move bishop f4. So this is kind of similar to London, right? We're still putting our bishop on f4, but the pawn structure is going to be different. We have a pawn on c4, we've got pressure on their center, and we're going to play e3, and we're going to be playing towards the queen side sometimes. Sometimes we're going to be flexible, and we're going to be able to play towards the king side, right? And this is actually a deceptively dangerous opening that white can play here. I remember playing this once over the board against a much higher rated player, and I just got a good position out of the opening. I ended up losing, of course, because it's hard to beat it's hard to beat higher rated players oftentimes. But in terms of the opening, I had succeeded in what I was trying to accomplish there, right? So this is a really good setup. It's very focused on the center on e5, right? You sometimes can take on c7, right? I'm not going to go into the theory too much here, but I just wanted to point out this is kind of our setup, and we're likely going to play e3 next, and we'll develop our bishop at some point, right? So this is a very solid setup. It's a very flexible setup, and it's a setup that puts a bit of pressure on your opponent early on, right? So this is going to be kind of tough for black to play against. There's a lot of games to go and study out there where, like, especially back in the day, right? Early 1900s, there's a lot of players playing this. Emmanuel Lasker, Jose Raul Capablanca, tons of players playing this. And so definitely go and study those games to learn the strategies of these positions. But this should give you already kind of a basic setup that, you get out of the first few moves in the opening with a good position, right? Going back, we of course also want to see what if they don't play e6, right? And so I'm going to go to another chapter in the study here, and I will show that here. This is, of course, the Queen's Gambit accepted. This is, I think, something that when you first start out playing the Queen's Gambit as white, you're maybe a little afraid of. What if they just take my pawn, right? This is kind of annoying to deal with. But luckily, this is not such a popular opening. It's, I think, it's not even that popular at lower levels, and it actually scores really well for white in the database I'm looking at right now. So this is something that you probably won't see too often, and when you do, you should be okay, right? What I recommend is to just play e3, right? We try and take the pawn back with our bishop right away. So the main difference between this setup and the last setup is that in the last setup, they never took on c4, and so we just got our dark square bishop out at some point, and then we played e3. Here, we're playing e3 before we can get our bishop out. So this is a bit of a downside, right? But we're going to be able to take this pawn back, and we'll look at if they try and defend it and try and hold on to it. But suffice to say, it's not very good to try and hold on to it. Even though our bishop is kind of stuck on c1 for now, right, we are going to have opportunities later to play e4 possibly and get our bishop out. And if we don't have those opportunities, right, sometimes we trade on d4, and now there's no e-pawn we can get out, right? So that's going to be something to keep in mind, is that you're really only temporarily blocking this bishop in. So, okay, first let's look at b5, right? This is kind of the move to try and really hold on to this pawn. I'm going to recommend here the move b3. There are other, you could also play a4. Keep that in mind. You could also play knight c3, probably. That should be fine. But b3 is really nice. We're just saying I'm going to take twice on c4. No big deal. And if they take on b3, then we take on b5. They can play b6 or c6 and attack our bishop, but we just retreat, allow this trade to happen. And in this sort of scenario, they have managed to hold on to the extra pawn, right? It is the Queen's Gambit. A lot of times people say that the Queen's Gambit is not a real Gambit because you're not really going to lose the pawn. In this case, we actually have lost the pawn, but only in the short term. It's really hard to see how black is going to be able to hold on to this pawn on a7 and maybe even this pawn on c6, right? Both of these are very weak. And we also have a lot of development, right? Our rook's developed, our bishop's developed, our knight's developed, we're about to castle, and all of these pieces can easily develop as well, right? Meanwhile, black really only has one piece in the game right now, which is the knight. So Black has kind of invested a lot of time and effort into being a pawn up, and we have perfectly good compensation for that, right? Meaning we have other advantages than just a pawn, right? We're pretty happy with our position. So going back, um, and usually we'll be able to get that pawn back in the long run. Bishop g4 is another move that you might sometimes see here. It's not very common at all, but just know you take on c4. There's nothing really special here about this for black. In fact, if anything, this is a little bit more dangerous for black. Say black plays kind of a common move, a6. This is not particularly, common in this position, but you do see it, in these types of positions. We actually have a really cool move already, putting black in a really tough spot. We can play knight e5. Double exclam, right? Double exclamation mark. The most common move for black is an added blunder on top of the blunder, right? a6 was already a blunder. They were already in a lot of trouble here. Probably best is just to get a bad position for black, right? You can maybe retreat this bishop somewhere. It's attacked twice, right? By both our knight and our queen. So maybe they could go back to e6, but then we could double their pawns, and that would not be great. This knight becomes really, really strong there. Now, you might be asking, wait a second, can't they just take our queen, right? And I want you to maybe pause the video if you want. Take a second to ask yourself, what happens if we lose our queen? Does this give us time to do anything here? And I will say that the most popular move for black here is to take the queen, even at somewhat higher levels. I was looking in the database, and there's a lot of people falling for this, playing bishop takes d1. Bishop takes d1 almost always wins for white. 99% of games, white wins, because after bishop takes d1, bishop takes f7. Checkmate. Game over, right? So we're threatening checkmate in one move. That's why bishop e6 was one of their better moves. It was to defend the checkmate threat. So, this is kind of like a positional and safe setup for white, but you still get some excitement, right? And that's what's going to make this really good for improving players. You're going to be able to not only play very solid positions, but play also very aggressive positions on occasion. Going back, instead though, we could get e6. This is the really solid variation here. By the way, after bishop g4, bishop takes, e6 is what they should be playing. And then their bishop's a little bit, trapped on the king side. It can't really get back. So there's pluses and minuses to that. But that's something they always have to be aware of, is their bishop on g4. Going back though, e6 traps their bishop. Just like in the Queen's Gambit Declined, if there's one thing you take away from this video is that this is going to be black's bad piece. This is the piece that is going to struggle because it's trapped behind this e6 pawn in both the Queen's Gambit Accepted and the Queen's Gambit Declined, right? And in this case, we just take on c4. And very common mistake here for black is play bishop b4 check. Kind of seems like a good idea because it gets you closer to castling as black and it gives check. But after bishop to d2, remember this was kind of our bad bishop, right? It was trapped behind our e3 pawn. And now we're just going to be able to trade this off, most likely. We might be able to play e4 later, right? But at the very least, we traded off what was actually their good bishop for our bad bishop. So it's a slight strategic win for us already if something like that were to happen. And it's very popular. It's actually the most common move for black here, right? Is to play this move. But okay, instead something like c5, not very popular, but this is the main move at top levels. You can simply castle. And just to kind of wrap this up, you're just going to develop normally. You're going to play knight to c3. A lot of times you move your queen. You play rook to d1, so you line up with their queen. You can get very aggressive positions here, and black can get into trouble very quickly, and white is not taking too much of a risk, right? That's kind of what I think makes this such a good repertoire for white, especially if you don't, like taking risks as white. Well, you can still put a lot of pressure on your opponent without any serious, like stress, right? You're not sweating over here thinking, "Oh man, I'm down 2 pawns. I've got to win this game," right? That's not the case with this opening. So, yeah, this tends to, I'll just show you an example line here. This tends to be really good for white, right? And you can look at this in more detail if you want in the study later. But the point is, we just get good development and we can start an attack before black is even castled oftentimes. So there's some nuances here. Probably, you won't get this position that often, but that's the basic idea, right? Is to just develop calmly and then start attacking. And black has spent a lot of time on pawn moves, right? A6, c5, e6, right? And we're developing quickly. One thing to point out, if they take on d4, that's perfectly fine because it opens up our bishop. And so we're getting to develop faster now. We're getting to line our rook up with their king. And there's only one pawn in the way now, right? We're very close to just breaking through and getting at that king. So, you have a very solid but aggressive position here as white. So that's the Queen's Gambit accepted. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Hopefully that's very easy to implement in your own games. And by the way, this whole A6 B5 thing, don't really be afraid of that. You can just drop back to B3. If they keep going, that's really not that great. You can go to C2 and, what were they doing with all these pawn moves, right? It's kind of a waste of time. So this tends to be a very easy to play opening, I think, for white, and an opening that, doesn't take too much risk, but has some real pressure on your opponent. In the future, in this video series, we're going to go over openings like the Rogozin, which we mentioned, right? The Slav, which is another very popular opening. The Semi-Slav, the Tarrasch, that's actually fairly popular. And we're going to go over weirder stuff like the Dutch, the Benoni, things like that. So, keep tuning in. Yeah, that's it for the QGD and the QGA, the two main, openings I think that you're going to face a lot, besides maybe the Slav. All right. Bye.